in everything I've done. You know, Sound of Music, Blood Brothers, the R thing, you know, R. You know. There's no this at all. I mean, she is weird.
Wonderful children, and we have 2 marvelous grandchildren as well. We still live together, but you know, he has his own life and I have mine.
When did you begin this business of show?
A very young girl at the time. I started when I was 7 years old.
You were a child prodigy?
Yes, I'm afraid.
In everything I've done, you know, The Sound of Music, Blood Brothers, the whole thing, you know, there's no in this at all. I mean, she is weird, wonderful children, and we have 2 marvelous grandchildren as well. We still live together, but, you know, he goes his own way, and I have mine. At 92, Petula Clark drops a devastating confession about the price of stardom. The downtown singer held on to secrets for decades, harassment by powerful producers, death threats over a political message, and the truth about her marriage to Claude Wolfe. Now she's telling all, including what really happened in that hotel room with Elvis Presley. Petula Clark's story begins with a name that wasn't even hers to begin with. She was born Sally Alwyn Clark on November 15, 1932, in Ewell, Surrey. But her father, Leslie, had other ideas. He combined the names of 2 of his ex-girlfriends, Pet and Ula, and came up with Petula. Her mother wasn't thrilled, but the name stuck. Just like that, her life already had a twist before it had even begun. She didn't have the kind of childhood where you stay in one place and grow up with the same friends. While her parents worked as nurses, she spent a lot of time in Wales with her grandparents in a small mining town called Abercynon. Later, when the war started, the family kept moving, trying to stay safe from the bombings. That constant change shaped her. She picked up accents, learned to adapt, and, without knowing it, was building the skills that would make her a performer. Her first time singing in public was almost too perfect to be real. She was just 7 years old, standing in a crowded pub surrounded by Welsh miners. The air was thick with smoke, the voices loud. But the moment she opened her mouth to sing, the room went quiet. It was a tiny glimpse of what was to come. The real turning point came in 1942. She was 9 years old when she and her father went to London's underground Criterion Theatre to record a message for her uncle, who was stationed in North Africa. It was supposed to be a simple radio broadcast, part of a BBC show called It's All Yours. Then, in the middle of everything, the air raid sirens went off. Explosions rumbled above as people in the shelter grew anxious. The show's producer needed a distraction. He asked if anyone wanted to perform. Petula raised her hand. At first, she wanted to do an impression of a famous comedian, but her father nudged her toward singing. She stepped onto a box to reach the microphone and began to sing Mighty Like a Rose. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the fear in the room. As she sang, the orchestra joined in, and for a few moments, the war outside didn't exist. That one performance changed everything. When the broadcast aired, the BBC was flooded with letters from listeners who wanted to hear more from this little girl with the angelic voice. Just like that, she became a regular on the radio. Over the next 3 years, she performed hundreds of times, her voice becoming a source of comfort for a nation at war. By 11, she was being called Britain's Shirley Temple. It wasn't just about her talent, it was the way she made people feel. She could mimic famous singers like Vera Lynn and Sophie Tucker, making audiences laugh one moment and bringing them to tears the next. Soldiers took her photo with them into battle. To them, she was more than a singer, she was a symbol of home, of everything they were fighting for. Her performances weren't just in grand theaters. She sang in bomb shelters, hospitals, and military camps. By 12, she had done over 500 shows for the troops. Then came the moment that sealed her place in history. In 1945, as the war in Europe ended, a massive celebration was held in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of people gathered, cheering, crying, embracing. And right in the middle of it all, Petula Clark stood and sang. The girl who had spent the war lifting spirits was now part of the nation's victory. McInnes Clark's rise to fame wasn't planned. It happened by chance. When she was just 12, she was singing for British troops at the Royal Albert Hall when director Maurice Elvey heard her. He was so impressed that he cast her in Medal for the General, 1944, even though she had never acted before. Just like that, she became Britain's Shirley Temple, a child star with a powerful voice and a natural screen presence. In the 5 years that followed, she appeared in 17 films. One of the most significant was I Know Where I'm Going, 1945, directed by the legendary Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger. She was only 13, but she stood out even among experienced actors. By 16, she had already performed for Winston Churchill, King George VI, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. People started calling her the singing sweetheart, a name that perfectly captured her growing stardom. Despite her film success, it was music that would define her career. In 1954, she recorded The Little Shoemaker, though at first, she didn't even want to. She thought the song was too childish for her evolving image. But her manager convinced her, and it turned out to be the right move. The song climbed to number 7 on the UK charts and shocked everyone when it reached number 1 in Australia. That made Clark the first British female artist to ever top the Australian charts, something unheard of at the time. What made the song even more groundbreaking was how far it spread. She recorded it in English, French, German, and Italian, a bold move in an era when most artists stuck to one language. The impact was massive. By the end of 1954, she had performed for a record-breaking crowd of 124,000 people at the exhibition ground. In Newcastle, Australia, she performed for the largest audience any performer in the country had seen up to that point. Her multilingual career didn't stop there. Incredibly, she recorded her first French song, Pronom Mona, in 1957 without speaking a word of the language. She learned it phonetically, mimizing the sounds without knowing what they meant. Still, her performance was so convincing that the song reached the French top 10. By 1962, she had mastered the language well enough to win the prestigious Grand Prix du Disque de France for Chariot. That same year, she had simultaneous hit records in 3 languages, A Chariot in French, Mew in German, and Romeo in English. No other artist had ever pulled that off. Clark didn't just translate her songs, she recorded entirely different tracks for each market. She sang in Italian, Spanish, and even Japanese, treating each language as a new artistic challenge. By the mid-1960s, her French hit YAY Twist had sold over 1 million copies in France alone. In 1964, Tony Hatch came to McInnes Clark with a song called Downtown. He believed it could be a hit, but Clark wasn't so sure. She thought the lyrics were too simple and not suited to her style. Hatch wouldn't give up. He was convinced the song had something special. Eventually, Clark agreed to record it. On October 16, 1964, at Pi Studios in London, the session began, and everything started going wrong. The electricity kept cutting out, forcing delays. Frustration in the room was rising fast. At one point, Clark was so fed up she nearly walked out, convinced the song was cursed. But they pressed on, determined to finish. Just minutes before the studio closed, they got the final take. On November 16, 1964, Downtown was released in 4 countries at the same time, something almost unheard of back then. In the US, it debuted on the Billboard Hot 100 at number 87. That was a promising start, but what happened next was shocking. The song took off like wildfire. Within a month, it had already climbed to number 5. On January 23, 1965, it hit number 1, making Clark the first British female artist to ever top the US charts during the rock and roll era. In the UK, it reached number 2, blocked from the top spot only by the Beatles' I Feel Fine. But that didn't stop Downtown from becoming a global sensation. It dominated the charts in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and West Germany. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a game-changer. In 1965, Downtown won a Grammy for Best Rock and Roll Recording. The competition was fierce. Clark was up against the Beatles and the Beach Boys, yet she walked away with the award. That was almost unheard of for a 32-year-old pop star in the youth-driven music scene of the 60s. After Downtown, Clark became unstoppable. Between 1964 and 1968, she had 15 consecutive top 40 hits in the US. Songs like I Know a Place, number 3, My Love, number 1, and Don't Sleep in the Subway, number 5, kept her on top. Strangely, while America embraced her as a superstar, her chart success in the UK wasn't as strong during that period. Clark wasn't just a success in English-speaking countries, she had been recording in French, German, and Italian since 1962, years before Downtown made her an international name. In France, she was so popular that she briefly considered abandoning her English-language career altogether. In Germany, her song Mew became the best-selling single by a foreign artist at the time, earning a gold record for selling 1 million copies. By the end of the 1960s, Clark had sold over 70 million records worldwide. In an era before streaming, before music could spread with a click, she became a true global star. McInnes Clark's jump into Hollywood in the late 1960s was unexpected. She was already a music star, but acting in major films was a different challenge. In 1968, at 35, she landed a lead role in Finian's Rainbow, starring opposite Fred Astaire, who was 69. A 34-year age gap between romantic leads was rare, even for Hollywood. The film was directed by a young Francis Ford Coppola in his first big studio project. Critics loved it, but audiences didn't show up in large numbers. It made $1.5 million at the box office, which wasn't enough to be considered a success. Still, Clark's performance stood out. She played Sharon McLonegan with confidence and warmth, earning a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy. Her next film, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, 1969, almost slipped away. She was originally cast as Catherine Bridges, but before filming began, producers replaced her with Sian Phillips. It was a crushing blow. But then, at the last minute, Phillips fell ill, and Clark was called back. Now, she had to step into a role made famous by Greer Garson in the 1939 version, a role that required her to age across 2 decades on screen. The pressure was immense, but she delivered, proving she wasn't just a singer who dabbled in acting. She was a real actress. Her performance connected with audiences, and the film's soundtrack, featuring her vocals, climbed to number 5 on the UK albums chart. Then came a bold new chapter. In 1981, at 48, Clark took on Broadway, starring as Maria von Trapp in The Sound of Music. It was a surprising choice. Maria was usually played by much younger actresses. But Clark brought depth and experience to the role, and audiences embraced her. She stayed in the production for 15 months, performing 8 shows a week, a brutal schedule. Even for younger performers, but she wasn't done yet. Her most daring stage role came in 1995. At 62, she was cast as Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, a role usually given to actresses in their 50s. It was a risk, but when she joined the US national tour, audiences saw something special. She played Norma as both grand and broken, capturing the character's tragic fall from stardom. The tour lasted 56 weeks across 23 cities, and Clark's performance was so strong that she was invited to reprise the role in London's West End in 1997. At that time, she was the oldest actress to ever play Norma Desmond, performing in over 600 shows. It was one of the most powerful roles of her career. Even in her 80s, Clark refused to slow down. In 2017, at 84, she released her 48th studio album, Living for Today. Her voice was still strong, and the album was a mix of originals and covers, including a surprising version of Steve Winwood's Higher Love. It reached number 46 on the UK albums chart, making her one of the oldest artists ever to chart. But what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of taking it easy, Clark hit the road. In 2018, at 85, she launched a 53-day tour across the US, performing in venues she hadn't visited since the 1960s. She played full 90-minute sets without an intermission, something even younger performers struggle with. The biggest shock came on February 23 at the B.B. King Blues Club in New York City. After finishing her scheduled set, she didn't leave the stage. Instead, she stayed for another 30 minutes, jamming with the house band in a spontaneous session that stretched the concert past midnight. During the taping of her NBC special on March 2, 1968, McInnes Clark did something that had never been done on American television. While performing on The Path of Glory with Harry Belafonte, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. It was a small, natural gesture lasting just 3.5 seconds, but in that moment, history was made. At precisely 8:47 p.m., Clark's touch became the first time a white woman had physical contact with a black man on American television. The timing could not have been more significant. Interracial marriage was still illegal in 17 states. The civil rights movement was at a boiling point, and just weeks later, Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated. That simple touch was not scripted. It was not planned. It happened because the song's message, an emotional plea against war, brought out a genuine connection between two artists. Clark, moved by the performance, reached out instinctively. That single moment shattered an unspoken racial barrier, and the country took notice. The reaction was immediate. NBC received more than 3,000 calls and letters in the first 24 hours. Some viewers were outraged. Others saw it as a long overdue step toward racial equality. But for one man in the room that night, the outrage was personal. Doyle Lott, a Chrysler executive whose company had sponsored the show, was horrified. He saw the touch as a threat, not just to social norms, but to car sales. He feared that Southern audiences would boycott Plymouth, so he made a demand, reshoot the scene without any physical contact. Lott's reaction exposed the deep racism still embedded in corporate America. His demand led to a 7-hour, high-stakes battle with network executives. He reportedly shouted, "Over my dead body will this go on air?" Chrysler's concern wasn't about artistic integrity or even public opinion, it was about money. If airing an interracial touch meant losing customers, they wanted it gone. But McInnes Clark refused. She had built her career on her own terms, and she was not about to let a sponsor erase an important moment. She and her husband, Claude Wolfe, knew what they had to do. At 2:15 a.m., after a 12-hour standoff with NBC and Chrysler, they destroyed every alternate take of the duet. 7 different versions of the performance were wiped, 37 minutes of footage gone forever. They used a magnet to erase the tape, ensuring that only one version could ever air, the one where she touched Belafonte's arm. Clark was risking everything. At the time, she had 15 consecutive top 40 hits in the US. She was at the peak of her career, making her first major push into American television. But she made her stance clear: the performance will be shown intact, or I will never work in American television again. At 9 p.m. on April 8, 1968, just 4 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, McInnes aired exactly as Clark had intended. The touch remained. Chrysler, despite all its efforts, had lost. And that brief moment of human connection, just 3.5 seconds long, became a milestone in television history. McInnes Clark's career was filled with unexpected encounters, but few were as surprising as the time she stumbled into John Lennon and Yoko Ono's famous bed-in for peace at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. It was June 1, 1969. Clark, visiting the city, had no idea she was about to be part of music history. In room 1742, Lennon was recording what would become an anthem, "Give Peace a Chance." The atmosphere was informal, almost chaotic. Poets, activists, and journalists packed the space. Clark found herself among them, handed a lyric sheet, and asked to join in. The recording setup was minimal, just a few microphones and a tape recorder brought in by a local studio owner. Despite the star-studded group, Clark's voice barely made it into the final mix. Over the years, she has admitted that she couldn't hear herself on the track at all. Still, the song became Lennon's first solo single, reaching number 2 in the UK and making its mark on the US charts. Looking back, Clark describes the whole experience as surreal. She hadn't realized in that moment that she was helping create a piece of musical history. A few weeks earlier, she had faced a very different kind of experience in Montreal. She was performing at Place des Arts, a venue where she had sung many times before. Clark, fluent in French, had always embraced her bilingual audience. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The tension between English and French speakers in Quebec was at a breaking point. The Quebec Liberation Front had carried out bombings that year, and cultural divisions ran deep. Clark was caught in the middle. When she sang in French, English-speaking audience members heckled her. When she switched to English, the French speakers did the same. It was a heartbreaking experience, something she had never faced before. Not all of Clark's unexpected encounters were serious. Some were just bizarre. In the late 1960s, during one of her performances in Las Vegas, she and her friend Karen Carpenter decided to spend a night off watching Elvis Presley's show. At this point, Elvis was deep into his comeback era, still commanding the stage like no one else. When he spotted Clark and Carpenter in the audience, he made sure to acknowledge them. After the show, he invited them backstage. Clark describes Elvis as drop-dead gorgeous that night, and it was clear he was interested. What wasn't clear at first was who he was interested in. Clark quickly realized he had romantic intentions toward both her and Carpenter. For a moment, the situation felt like something out of a movie. Elvis Presley, one of the most famous men in the world, was charming them both. But Clark, always the professional, sensed where things were heading. With a bit of quick thinking, she grabbed Carpenter and made a graceful exit. "We had other things to do," she later joked. In 1979, McInnes Clark sent a simple telegram, a brief message congratulating Margaret Thatcher on becoming Britain's first female Prime Minister. To Clark, it was about celebrating a historic moment for women in leadership. But to many of her fans, it looked like something else, an endorsement of Thatcher's conservative politics. The backlash was immediate. Hate mail poured in. Some radio stations stopped playing her music. Invitations to major events quietly disappeared. Her album sales in the UK took a hit. Clark tried to explain. She wasn't making a political statement, just acknowledging history. But once people make up their minds, explanations don't always help. For years, the controversy followed her. It took time to rebuild her standing in the British music industry. In a 1985 interview, she admitted she never expected a simple message to cause such an uproar. It was a hard lesson on how, for public figures, even small gestures can have massive consequences. The Thatcher telegram remains one of the most striking examples of how politics and entertainment don't always mix. Moreover, Clark has never shied away from difficult conversations. When it comes to the entertainment industry, she knows firsthand how brutal it can be, especially for women. Starting in the 1950s, she dealt with harassment, pay inequality, and being overlooked in favor of less talented men. She stayed silent about it for decades. But in a 2018 interview, she finally opened up. One story stood out. In 1965, a powerful producer invited her to a hotel room for what she thought was a business meeting. When she got there, it became clear he had other intentions. Clark managed to escape. But speaking out at the time could have ended her career. That was the reality for women in entertainment: stay quiet or risk everything. The unfairness went beyond harassment. Clark revealed that she was regularly paid less than male artists, even those with less experience. She was passed over for opportunities, told to look pretty and not make trouble. It was simply accepted that men were in charge, she said. Challenging that was seen as career suicide. But times changed, and Clark became more vocal. In recent years, she has supported movements like the Me Too movement and Time's Up, speaking out in interviews, writing op-eds, and appearing in documentaries about sexism in the industry. In 2020, she made one thing clear. It's heartening to see progress, but we must remain vigilant. The fight for true equality is far from over. McInnes Clark's love story with Claude Wolfe started with an instant connection. It was 1961 when she met him at Vogue Records to discuss her French music career. She was 29, and he was a French publicist. Their relationship moved fast, and before the year ended, they were married. Over time, they had 3 children, Barbara in 1961, Catherine in 1963, and Patrick in 1972. For decades, their marriage seemed solid. Fans saw them as a lasting couple in an industry where relationships rarely survived. But in 2013, Clark made a shocking revelation. After 52 years of marriage, she admitted that she and Wolfe were not in a romantic relationship anymore. They never divorced, but they no longer lived as husband and wife in the traditional sense. Instead, they built a different kind of bond, staying legally married while leading separate lives. What made this even more unusual was that Wolfe remained Clark's manager. Their professional relationship never ended. Wolfe continued managing her career. Until the very end, when he passed away on March 20, 2024, at the age of 93, Clark was devastated. In a heartfelt Facebook post, she called her grief overwhelming and said she was lost for words. Their marriage had lasted 63 years, evolving from passion to a deep partnership that defied expectations. Even without romance, their connection never broke. But her career didn't just reshape her marriage, it also impacted her children. Clark has spoken openly about the guilt she carries as a mother. She wanted to be everything at once, a loving parent, a devoted wife, and a successful performer. That meant tough choices. When she had shows in Las Vegas, she would leave her home in Geneva, Switzerland, at the last possible moment, trying to spend every extra second with her kids. But that left her exhausted. She would arrive in the US with barely any time to adjust before stepping on stage. After performing, instead of networking or relaxing, she would take the first flight back to Geneva. This schedule drained her, and over time, she realized both her family and her work had suffered. "I think both my performances and my family suffered," she admitted. Even now, as her children reassure her that she was a good mother, the guilt lingers. "I do still feel guilty about not being the perfect mother and probably always will." McInnes Clark's career is packed with achievements, but one of the most overlooked is her work as a songwriter. In 1998, she was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, not just as a performer, but as a composer in her own right. Many fans might not realize that Clark wrote several songs throughout her career, including an anti-war duet with Harry Belafonte. That performance was bold, controversial, and way ahead of its time. Her success wasn't just limited to writing or singing. Clark was one of the best-selling artists in the world. In 1966, she won the Midem Award for most sales in Europe by a European artist. The following year, she won again, this time for having the highest worldwide sales by any female artist. In 1968, she earned a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress in a Musical for Finian's Rainbow, standing alongside some of Hollywood's biggest names. On stage, she was just as impressive. She received BAFTA nominations for her roles in The Sound of Music, Blood Brothers, Sunset Boulevard, and Mary Poppins. Few artists can dominate both music and theater, but Clark did it effortlessly.